Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. One of the most well-known cryptids in terms of the kind of international scopes of cryptids is referred to as the Mokele-Mbembe. Often, Mokele-Mbembe is represented as a living sauropod dinosaur. Now, Mokele-Mbembe has a long history outside of what today we would consider to be modern cryptozoology, or even just cryptid fanatic circles in general. Mokele-Mbembe is referenced in literature dating back to the early 20th century, and appears to at least have a somewhat strong presence in the local African mythology that accompanies it, which happens to be in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, especially around the Lake Tele area where sightings supposedly have taken place. If it appears that I'm kind of rushing through the history of Mokele-Mbembe here, it's frankly because I am. There's a particular piece of evidence that I would like to discuss revolving around Mokele-Mbembe, but to really get there in a proper way, it just feels that so much needs to be established, and to do that, going quickly through it might be a bit of a good route to take. After all, it is called Crash Course Cryptozoology. The main players that are centric to this particular story, which we're going to discuss briefly here, are Herman Regusters and his wife, Kia Warren. Regusters was born in 1933 and had a long career, and really along several careers. He worked for the United States Air Force, as well as studied physics and law, and Kia herself had studied psychology and was a medical practitioner on the expedition that this evidence was collected on. At some point in his life, Herman took a particular interest in the legend of the Mokele-Mbembe, the Western explorers who had heard stories of this strange long-necked aquatic animal, and he decided to launch an expedition to investigate these claims. It should be noted that Herman makes it clear in the paper that he authored on this expedition, entitled An Investigation into Rumors Concerning a Strange Animal in the Republic of the Congo, that he was not explicitly looking for a dinosaur. Rather, he was interested in the mythology itself, the rumors of a species, and if there was a link of truth between those two things. This brings us to the alleged evidence. While their expedition was conducted around Lake Tele, Herman and Kia were able to record a strange vocalization, which Herman describes in the following passage from his previously mentioned paper. At 11:45 on November 4th, as Kia and I investigated the southernmost lobe of the lake, an extraordinary and loud animal cry was heard. It came from the jungle along the shore of the lobe, and seemed to be not more than 40 or 50 meters into the thicket. The cry can best be described as starting with a low, windy roar, then increasing to a deep-throated, trumpeting growl. Sounds of a large beast making through the brush were clearly distinguishable as it moved away from us further into the swamp. The roar recurred in about 5 minutes and then was not heard again. After a lapse of about 30 minutes, we disembarked from the boat and entered the jungle in an attempt to locate some trace of the beast. However, the standing water and soft leaf beads obstructed any such possibility. Subsequently, the cry was heard by all members of our party at various times throughout our stay at the lake. The Congolese attributed its source to the Mokele-Mbembe. Attempts to record the sound on several occasions resulted only in poor quality productions, owing to the high level of foreground noises. And without further ado, with that backstory having been now put in place, this is the recording Herman came back to the States with. His description in the paper seems essentially accurate to what we're looking at, if maybe only being accurate to the first part of his description, that being the low, windy roar that he references. It's a strange noise. Now, it should be noted that this noise has undergone a little bit of examination, and unfortunately, it hasn't really produced any clarity on the subject. All of the people who've been able to examine it professionally have just said they're not really sure what exactly it is. The question that the cryptozoologist would be interested in here is, of course, what animal has produced this noise? Now, of course, we are treading some water and kind of making a few leaps to get to that question itself. There's no way that we can confirm that this isn't some other kind of natural environmental noise, that it isn't something that was produced using an instrument, etc. To get an idea of what kind of animal this could be if it was an animal, we of course need to focus on the animal perspective. Now, we can compare this sound audibly to other sounds made by animals in the area of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but it may be a bit more helpful to use a spectrographic analysis. To briefly understand what it is that a spectrogram actually shows us, spectrograms show us sound and the frequency at which sounds occur. The frequency, being measured in a unit called hertz, is essentially how many times a sound wave is repeated every second. Of course, sound itself is a wave of vibration, and in order for a sound to be lengthier and for it to also sound higher or lower, it needs to repeat itself a certain amount of times per second to reach those types of vocal or audible signatures. What a spectrogram shows us is essentially a graph of that kind of dynamic, wherein the sound is focused in bright colors and kind of dims as the sound grows less audible or is less repeated at certain frequencies. And by doing that and scaling it next to accurate markers for where hertz would be on the graph, we can actually determine where a lot of these sounds are happening on that frequency ladder. As we can see with Herman's recording, the sound is most intense and audible around 500 hertz. What we also see is that this is not the same, but a similar area of frequency that many of the large mammals native to the Democratic Republic of the Congo produce. We see, for instance, in African elephants that a lot of the sound intensity is gathered close towards that same line, with hippopotami and white rhinos also being close matches in terms of where their intensity tends to be focused the most at. Again, not completely. In fact, the closest is probably the white rhino, but that specific line of signature only runs through about half of the types of vocalizations that white rhinos produce. Granted, these spectrograms have also been created from clips of audio that these animals produce, and not every single vocalization that they produce is going to be included in that audio. You'd have to spend a lot of time around an animal to get all of its vocalizations. So, admittedly, and very importantly, we are working with a limited scope there. There is an interesting connection, even if it's only coincidental, between the audio that Herman Regusters came back to the States with and the sounds that giraffes produce. Specifically, a somewhat recently discovered vocalization that is referred to as a nocturnal hum that some giraffes seem to produce shows us some similar audio patterns to the Regusters recording. The baseline is similar, and even some of the higher up frequencies that we see, where the intensity kind of blips in and out, also look similar and happen at similar frequencies. Now, looking at things like the African hornbill and several other avians and reptiles, we don't really get a close match, not just in what they sound like, but in their audio signatures. So it seems, in terms of what the spectrograms can tell us, this is something that might not be a large mammal, but it is more consistent in terms of animal vocalizations with a large mammal, which to some degree makes a lot of sense. Typically speaking, and this is especially true of mammals, the larger the animal is, the lower its frequency and sound will be. If we wanted to stretch the assumptions, which we should not do, we could also say that it might be interesting that a long-necked animal's vocalizations seem to have the most similarities with the Regusters recording. But it might be worth admitting that, because if we're trying to figure out if this is misidentification, for example, perhaps there's a vocalization that's unknown that belongs to a known species that we could potentially pin this on when we have more data on that, and perhaps these similarities might lead us down that way. Maybe the most interesting thing that I myself came across studying this audio is that even though its signature is very similar to these other large mammals, it doesn't actually sound anything like those mammals, at least not with the vocals that I was able to work with or track down. But there is one animal that it seems to have a stronger resemblance to, very, very slightly. And believe it or not, that would be one of the extinct sauropod dinosaurs, the Brachiosaurus. Now, of course, we don't have a perfect profile of what Brachiosaurus would have actually sounded like. There is a fantastic YouTube channel called Studio, which actually uses the scientific methods available to them to produce what would have been very easy sounds for certain prehistoric species to make. And the Brachiosaurus one, out of all of the native animals of the Republic of the Congo, of course the Brachiosaurus not being a native species, it's closer. I'd like to play the audio briefly just so we can kind of get an idea of the airiness that appears to be present, the almost deep whistling sound. What's interesting on top of that potential similarity is that a paper published on Explore Sound, which is authored by Professor Dooling, Professor Gleich, and Professor Manley, all of which who respectively work in psychology, the ENT department, and zoology of various universities, entitled What Did Dinosaurs Hear?, shows us that the hearing range of the Brachiosaurus would have not been that far off from where the sound is most intense in the Regusters recording. This graph here essentially shows the lowest and highest frequencies that different species in both prehistoric and modern times are capable of hearing. So as you can see on the rightmost side of the solid line representing human hearing is where we get the farthest away from the bottom line, which would be where the sound is most audible. And in the Brachiosaurus's line, we see that it dips close to right between 100 and 1,000, and of course, the halfway point there would be about 500 kilohertz, which is about where the Regusters recording tends to be its most intense. This is not to say at all that we have audio recording here of a surviving sauropod dinosaur. Rather, what it might be showing us is that we are looking at, if this is a new species, which again, we're already making many assumptions by going to that, but if this is a new species that we're not yet scientifically aware of, it has vocal similarities, which may mean structure similarities in terms of its vocal cords, to long-necked animals, large long-necked animals, which may be the reason why the eyewitness sketches are produced the way that they are, why the animal tends to be depicted the way that it is, and why so many people have been so ready to call it a surviving long-necked sauropod. This is a very speculative analysis of this audio, but I haven't found anything as in-depth as this particular analysis yet, and of course, I'm not an acoustician. I don't study animal audio professionally. I'm working with limited data and just drawing comparisons to attempt to see and understand the mechanisms of these comparisons and see if maybe there's a way that this could be parsed out somehow. Right now, of course, there's not, but we do have a couple of interesting leads, and having a spectrographic analysis, we are able to pinpoint which animals it's closer to. I'd love to know what all of you think of this, because this is just, as I dive further into Mokele-Mbembe, I come across more and more examples of things that I'd really like to talk about, this, of course, being one of them. And this is a quite exciting video to produce, and I truly hope that I've gotten all of the points that I wanted to get across in here. It seems that I've gotten the main ones, but of course discussion is always open here, and I would love to know especially if I have missed anything. That being said, until next time.